He says it's not going to end, but I haven't given the talk yet, and so you can decide later. Just want to check and make sure this all works. All right. Yeah, so it does feel a lot like coming home to me, I have to say. So there are several things I've noticed. One was the LaGuardia Airport that I came to last time and the one I just went to today are not the same. The other is that I remember coming before there was even a building out here in Hempstead. Then I remember coming when there was this small one-block building, which I think is connected here somehow. And now there's this extraordinary place. I have to say, with each iteration, yes, it is more beautiful, but I mean that in the other way. Like, with each iteration of coming back, it's more beautiful to know more people and to enjoy the time together. So thank you for making me part of the family. I'll behave myself, as I say, but only a little. So I thought we could get into a topic of the sciences of learning and the future of medical education, because it seems befitting of an academy talk. In part, also, it's not a whole LIC talk, so don't worry about that. No, not all about longitudinal clerkships. But you will have some issues of educational continuity in it, for sure. I just want to make sure I thank the team that actually is doing all the work while I get to come hang out with my friends here again. And just mention that I have no disclosures or conflicts of interest. Now, I'm originally from Rochester, New York, which, just to remind you, is not Westchester. Rochester is the one way the heck up. And my fast speaking is not Rochesterian speaking, it's just me. But I'm grateful to be in a place where people actually don't mind that so much. So here's how we'll do our talk together today. We'll think about test-enhanced learning, one of the sciences of learning. We'll think about the desirable difficulties. We will think about spacing of learning. We will think about interleaving of learning. We will think about the self-theories of the great Carol Dweck. We will think about deliberate practice, as we were speaking about a moment ago. And in an effort to animate these ideas, I will try to put forth these ideas in the way that I do the talk, right? So that means that if we have test-enhanced learning, which is the sort of idea of testing for learning, I should at least quiz you at some point, because that's what testing for learning is. My point is there's sort of a little bit of a meta thing going on here. I'm going to teach you something as I'm trying to animate the actual thing I'm teaching. All right. However, to do that well, there are 3 requirements for remembering things. So one is about encoding. One is about storage. One is about retrieval, right? So what is encoding? It's sort of the acquisition or putting it in. Storage is persistence or keeping it in. And retrieval is getting it back out for later use. A perfectly testable question for the audience, so you've been forewarned. Now, so we should start again by recognizing there are 6 things I'm going to speak about today, these 6. There are 6 things about which we will speak today, which I may happen to ask you, like as in now. There's a reason for all of this. It's not just to be sort of kitsch. But so what are these 6 domains of educational science we will discuss today? Now, I think it would be, unless you've peeked at this talk before, it'd be kind of hard to hold on to all 6 of them. So it seems only fair that you should grab a person next to you for a moment and see if you can together think of any of those 6. And the odds are, do you think you'll get all 6? I think probably not, right? Fair enough. Grab someone around you, right? So just for a moment, see if any of those things hold, even one. All right, it's the modern world. I realize there's those who photograph. Yeah, that's brilliant. Well done. All right, so can we communally, because communal is a thing here, also in education, can we communally try to go for the 6? What are some of the 6? Test-enhanced learning, testing for learning, deliberate practice, desirable difficulties, spacing, interleaving, and the good Carol Dweck. Right. So shall we not? There they are. All right. Hold on to them, though, because it seems like getting invited back is all well and good, but actually producing or contributing to the well-being of the community would be even better. All right, these are the 6 things we will do today. So first, test enhanced learning. And I give an image here now. Sometimes you can do things in words, some things you can do in images, right? The image of the flashcards. Desirable difficulties, all right? You have to put the brain to work. It has to be kind of hard. Right? There's some work in this. Spacing, this sort of image of the wide open space there. Interleaving, like the deck of cards, the interleaving of pages of a book or 2 books or of cards together. The self-theories of Carol Dweck, all well and good to advertise her book, but better to give an image which actually is what the self-theories are about, the getting back on the horse. In deliberate practice, here you see the coach coaching the person to keep practicing their piano. Those will be our 6 images and our 6 notions. All right, let's start with the first one. So test enhanced learning, also known as the testing effect or testing for learning. We should think about these flashcards. Now, I'm going to give you the original sort of, I should say, Western civilization data that looked into this effect, and it's quite interesting. Before I do that, I want you to think flashcards would be a way in which I could quiz myself, whereas the Socratic method is a way in which we can actually interrogate others. I don't mean any kind of mean Socrates. I mean the good old-fashioned real Socrates of Socratic fame, where the students came miles and miles and miles just to engage in this iterative back and forth questioning conversation with a great teacher, right? So think about quizzing ultimately, quizzing oneself and also being quizzed. So you can imagine the old Socratic way. I can ask you, we can ask each other, having this back and forth Socratic dialogue. That's a kind of quizzing effect or testing effect you could do in conversation. There's also, of course, that somebody could provoke or teach in a way. Dr. Smith and I were having this conversation just a moment ago, where you could help the learner then become able to quiz themselves or interrogate themselves or have the curiosity and the desire to go look it up, sort of generating the idea of a person themselves generating questions and seeking information. Because ultimately, that's of great value. I don't want to say, though, that these other social ones aren't also of value, and you'll find in some of the other parts of the talk that these social engagement means are important. But ultimately, the idea is querying oneself or being queried as a way of learning. The original paper comes from Rudiger and Karpicki from several years ago. I can show you the data from those original studies from Washington University of St. Louis. There were 120 undergraduate students. They were divided into 2 groups of 60 students in each group. Each group read a different one of 2 prose passages. One passage was about the sun, one was about dolphins. So in the 2 groups would learn the material, and in the first phase, they would study the material, and then they would have a little pause, usually a 5-minute pause, and then they would restudy the same material, have the same 500-word or 275-word paragraph. The other group would study the material, have the 5-minute pause, some kind of distraction like math problem or something. But then in the second phase, they would not restudy it. They would have a blank paper, and they had to write down on the paper everything they remembered from the first study. So that's called study test, as opposed to study restudy. And they were quizzed then at 5 minutes, 2 days, and 1 week for how much they retained. And at 5 minutes, at 2 days, and 1 week, you see the results. The study restudy group in the green holds on to the most in the immediate 5 minutes after, which gives credence to the idea of cramming. But as time goes on, there's a classic drop that is seen. There's been a whole bunch of domains for which this study has been done again in sort of different contexts, and you sometimes find it as high as 90 down to 20, the 90-20 drop. This actually wasn't as bad, the 81 to 42 drop, but that drop-off has been seen at a week's time. What's clear, though, is that those who did study and then test actually retained more at the further out time of being tested. So that was sort of interesting to them, so they did a second study. There are 180 undergrad students at WashU St. Louis, divided into 3 groups of 60. And each group gets one of two, people in the groups get either one or the other of the 2 prose passages about the sun or about dolphins. The groups do the following. One group gets study, 5-minute kind of math problem or distractor, restudy, 5-minute distractor, restudy, 4 times. Study, 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 S, 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 S. The second group gets study, a distractor, study, a distractor, study, a distractor, blank paper. And the last group gets study, 5-minute distractor, blank paper, 5-minute distractor, blank paper again, 5-minute study, blank paper again. to try to write down all the things they remembered from only that one moment of study they got. And they were tested at 5 minutes and at 1 week. So again, it looks like the cramming effect has benefit at 5 minutes, but there's this, again, similar drop-off when you see it even a week later. And by the way, if you go out longer, the drop-off goes even further down. Both groups, including the yellow here, the study test group, drop over time. All 3 groups drop over time. But the group that drops the slowest is the group that had this provoking themselves, quizzing themselves, the blank paper of having to draw it back out, forcing retrieval. That group maintains more longer. I would not pose, they don't pose, nobody poses, don't cram. Cramming works for the test at 5 minutes or a day later. It's just that cramming doesn't work for long-term retention. So cramming would be the adjunct to getting those last few points. It's not the way of actually learning anything, ultimately. So say the data. So a fun other way they did this was not through the lens of what was remembered, but through the lens of what was forgotten. So they can do like how much forgetting is important. How much forgetting is important? What? Watch. There's the amount you held on to, your initial recall. Then there's the amount you held on to at the time of, let's say, a week later, the final recall. And if you subtract those, that's how much you forgot. I held on to 90%. Then a week later, I held on to 70%. I lost 20%. That's what I forgot. The percent forgotten, then, is just that how much you forgot over how much you had. So like imagine the 90. A week later, you had 70 of it. That's 20% you forgot. You can make that percent of the total, so it's like 20 over 90, or a 22% forgetting rate. So studies that looked at forgetting, all right, showed this. If you have these study, you just keep rereading the same stuff, right? You actually forget more over time than those who do study, test, and study, test. This is the week later data. Okay, that's kind of interesting. It turns out what happens is we learn from literature on spacing, which we'll get to later in our talk, as you know, because it's one of the 6, that there's an amount of necessary forgetting. That's a term in the educational sciences. Necessary forgetting. You have some, you forget some, and then you're reminded. And there's a right amount of forgetting that helps your reminding get you back up higher and hold longer. If you forget too much, the reminding doesn't get you quite as far back up. But strangely, if you forget less, the reminding also doesn't get you as high either. So there's actually an amount of necessary forgetting, which is helpful, which we can get into when we do the spacing here shortly after. Each one of the 6 sections I will summarize with the image that we talked about, some images we talked about, and some pithy little cute memory thing to hold on to. After all, I'm going to test you again at the end. All right, so this issue of testing for learning. Think about flashcards, think about quizzing, think about retrieval, all right? And the idea is you learn how to retrieve. You learn to get the benefit of retrieving through learning by actually retrieving the blank paper, making yourself have to kind of pull it back up. That's the essence of testing for learning. All right, on to desirable difficulties. The hard work of learning, some people call it. There's a cool lab at UCLA that works on the hard work of learning. We're going to get into the kind of famous classic graph from Lev Vygotsky, the great educator, philosopher, in a moment. I want you to see the graph because I'm going to show you the words that explain this graph, and then we'll go back to the graph. There's a green sloping thing that goes upward. The way of understanding this is at the bottom of the green, there's a line at the bottom of the green, there's a line at the top of the green, there's a space in between, which is the green. All right? Something slopes upward. Now, what is a sloping? How much competence is the x-axis? How hard is it? The level of challenge is the y-axis. More competence, more challenge. We'll see, how does this all work? Watch. Vygotsky has this notion of the zone of proximal development that many of you know about, or often referred to as the ZPD. Here are his exact words, the great philosopher. It is the distance between, the ZPD, the distance between the actual developmental level as determined by independent problem solving, sort of where the person is at. It's an old Harvard joke. You guys ever know this old Harvard joke about adding? Okay. Students walking on Harvard's campus stops and says, excuse me, where's the library at? That's the questioner. And the Harvard person with the bow tie and kind of the tightness and whatever says, at Harvard, we do not end our sentences with prepositions. So, I'm so sorry. Where's the library at? All right. All right. But the question, thank you. But, the actual developmental level as determined by independent problem solving versus, or shown as different from, the level of potential development, that's the higher line, as determined through problem solving under adult guidance, under coaching, under benefit in collaboration with more capable teachers or peers. All right, there's some level that someone is at, there's some level that someone could be at, there's some level space in between that they could get to if only they were helped along with somebody who's more able. That's how this works. The bottom green line is the level at which someone's ability resides at their best. Below which, there's sort of the white space below, you see it says boredom. They're very good at it, it's too easy. Then there's the green zone, we'll get into that in a second. Then there's the top of the green zone, that line, above which it's anxiety. It's just too hard to do. One cannot do it even with help, okay? The green zone then is the level they could attain if they get the proper help, the zone of proximal development. That's the space available for learning with coaching and assistance. Classic Vygotsky. This is theory, not science. And the whole point of the talk was to do educational science, so this is uncool. But this gets us to the science of desirable difficulties. All right, let us try to work on this for a moment. Anybody? Who's got it? It is Macbeth. It's Shakespeare, right? She should have died hereafter. There would have been a time for such a word. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty face. Yeah, right? And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle is the, right? All right. So this has actually been studied as compared to this, for which one facilitates learning. It turns out that if you learn it this way, you actually retain it longer. Now that feels a bit like a parlor trick. All right? And if that parlor trick weren't good enough, how about this one? So there have actually been studies like this, where which way facilitates learning and retaining better. It turns out if it's just a whisper harder, people actually retain it better. We have to do some work. Now this doesn't seem totally applicable to medical education to me, although I do like Shakespeare. Oops, that was quick. But there are very carefully done, here's an archetypal study, there are very carefully done studies that look at the hard work of learning, encoding difficulty in memory towards a unifying theory, and a series of papers that followed this. So there are other very brilliant ones that help us understand how doing the hard work of learning facilitates skill building retention or retention of facts. Here's a fun one. When the outline of a lecture proceeds in a different order from the textbook passage, the efforts to discern the main ideas and reconcile the discrepancy make better recall of the content. That's getting closer to classroom teaching to some degree. Yeah, it gets better than that, though. It got us to the field of what's called generation, which is not just about recall. Again, this, Dean Smith and I were having this thought about like facts and recall. Is this the real essence? No. Reasoning, doing the work. All right, that's what we want our students to be able to do. So generation is problem solving. Now, there's great literature on problem solving that is the next kind of literature that followed the desirable difficulties literature. And I'll show you an example of this in a moment. All right. Problem solving, though, is not recall. Some recall is required to solve problems, yeah, but it's not the same as recall. So let's just give an example. All right, here's a recall kind of question. What's the definition of the sine of an angle? Anybody doing 9th grade math with their children recently? Excellent, right? So the sine of an angle is the comparison of the length of two sides of a right triangle, or the length of the opposite over the length of the hypotenuse, right? Excellent. All right. So, but that's a recall type question, right? So here's another one, and we're counting on you now, right? So another recall question. Excellent, guys. Oh, so I've gone to so many med schools where people don't know any of this, right? Okay, so you can see how these are recall. Like there's something you could know, and you say, well, there it is. That's not generation. These are not generation. Generation is much more important for learning. Generation is much more linked to difficulties, desirable difficulties. Remember, desirable ones means they're in that green zone. They're not so hard they produce anxiety. They're not so easy they produce boredom. They're desirable difficulties, but they're difficult. Generation requires difficulty. So we have to do some that's a little harder. All right. Here's problem solving. Here's generation. Assuming the Earth is a perfect sphere, it's not. But if it were a perfect ball, perfect sphere, and the equator were 24,000 miles around, it's a few hundred miles more, then the average width of a time zone at the equator, there's 24 hours in a day, there's 24 time zones, it's 1,000 miles wide. Is that fair? It's 24,000 miles around. It's one trip around is an entire day. 24 time zones, 24,000 divided by 24. Okay. However, having that little bit of a knowledge might allow you to have this cool question. Now, before I tell you the question, I have to tell you why I care about this question. So I live in Boston, Massachusetts now. To get from Boston, Massachusetts back to my hometown of Rochester, New York, you drive exactly, it depends how fast you drive, but it's basically 6 hours due west. Here's what annoys me about Boston, Massachusetts, probably the only thing. This time of year, just a week ago, we set our clocks back. Why do we set our clocks back? In Rochester, people love to say this, in Rochester we have chicken wings, in Rochester we have the Bills. In Rochester, all right, the sun sets later. The summers have these long, wonderful nights, right? The mornings it's dark, because mornings should be dark. We go to the bus stop in the dark and nothing bad happens, right? But in Boston, for some reason, where it's already sun rising too early and sun setting too early, they set the clocks back, which makes it worse. It rises even earlier. It's like being in an operating room at 5 o'clock in the morning. You're like, why is it so light in here, right? And the sun sets too early. It annoys me. You can see it really bothers me. So thus I asked this question. What's the average time zone width at latitude of X degrees? And we're way the heck up here in the north. What's our time zone width? Because I'm feeling like it's a little bit too wide here between Boston and, actually, I went to the University of Michigan for residency. It's way the heck out. It's in the same time zone. The sun sets so nicely late in Michigan. It's wonderful. What's the average time zone width at latitude X degrees? If we can do this, so we don't have to solve this as a community. It would be really annoying to do with you, but watch. It requires that same triangle, not sine, but cosine. There's our circle, right? You can solve the problem. See a little triangle in there, right? And that's a little radius. And that's the same radius here. Oh my gosh, the hypotenuse is actually then the radius, right? But we need to know this radius here to understand the circumference at that latitude, don't we? Which we would then divide by 24. So we can just figure out that that's actually this number here, which, oh my gosh, how conveniently is the cosine of that angle, which is the latitude angle, whatever. You don't have to know geometry, but the point is that you can see that's very, very different than recall, right? It's applying that recall stuff to an actual problem. That creates a desirable difficulty. So you can hold on to the idea of desirable difficulties, you can hold on to the idea of generation, but hold on to the idea that's way, way different than things that are too easy or things that are simply recall. And it's important for learning to have this desirable difficulty and generation issue. Create learning by creating necessary effort, by slowing down and from generating beyond mere recall. All right, that's number 2. Fair enough? Just got to keep you where we're going here. All right. These next two, I admit, get me a little fired up. Spacing and interleaving. So I'll do them straightforwardly. Here's a classic paper on spacing and interleaving. It's a research summary paper. Spacing, often in educational speak, is referred to as longitudinal. Interleaving, referred to as integrated. So that's the kind of educational science terms. These are kind of the educational design terms. I'm kind of excited about the latter two. But we're going to get into the former two, the same notions. All right. We'll do spacing first. To do spacing, I'm going to bring you into this next page, not this page, the next page, which is a 3-dimensional graph. You do not show a 3-dimensional chart to your friends. I realize that's just rude. But to get through the graph together, I'll take you through this page first. Before I get too far, I just want to say one more thing. I gave this presentation, not the full presentation, but this particular part right here, I think at the double AMC meeting maybe say 3-4 years ago. I was feeling so excited. The room had like 400 people in it. I spoke slowly, actually, for once. My hair was okay. I had more hair than it was a good day. I finished the talk, and up to the podium walks one of my favorite mentors, a friend of many of ours. He walks up, and with his South African accent, now you know who it is, says to me, "David, congratulations. That huff is never a good thing. So he says, I just have to tell you, though, I have a deep concern. I said, about something other than the talk, I hope? About the talk. That three-dimensional graph, no, you can't do that. You can't do that to an audience if you respect the audience. I said, but it's core educational science. You can't deprive the audience of that. Can you, Malcolm? And he says, you can show the graph. You just have to animate the graph. So I just want to show you. In the next graph, I actually animate the graph as a respectful nod to Malcolm Cox. All right. We can't get to the graph, though, unless we can do this. There is a space in time between when you ultimately learn something and when you're tested or when you have to know it. And in medicine, that's often a very long time. We practice some skills now that we won't do again until our internship. Ideally, a curricula spiral, yes. But there are plenty of things we learn once, we don't do again for a year, 2 years, 3 years, skills or knowledge. There's also a space in time, hence this expression spacing, between learning and relearning, and relearning and relearning and relearning. So there's a space called the study gap between learn and relearn, and a space called the test delay between your final learning and when you actually have to demonstrate and know something. Then, of course, there's how well or how much you retain, how much you actually know. So you see, this is going to create the 3 axes in the next graph, and I will use the exact same colors. All right, the study gap, test delay, and that green thing for how much you retain. You guys ready for the 3 dimensions? 1, 2, 3. All right, don't worry. All right, here, the animation. That is the amount of time, it's all washed out here, but that's the amount of time of the test delay from like 0 days out to a year. This axis is the amount of time for the study gap, the time between learn and relearn. And that's how much you retain. It's, in this case, test score. I'm just going to go back for a second, right? Study gap, test delay, and test score. All right. Up here in the Northeast, up there, that's a very short test delay. It's like the cramming examples I gave a moment ago, where you study something, and then like 5 minutes later or 1 day later, you have to produce what you know. It's a very short test delay, and you can see the test score is very, very high. You retain most everything 5 minutes later or a day later, depending on how complex the task is or how much you have to know. All right, here's the problem. See the little yellow thing down there? If you add only a little bit, that's 3 weeks, this arrow, 3 weeks of test delay. You learned it, and then 3 weeks later, you had to demonstrate it. It's way down for how much you retain. So watch this. It's over there, which is about 20%. It's that classic 90 to 20 drop that you see in so many studies of educational literature about retention. So a 3-week delay gave you this 90 to 20, 90% retained to 20% retained for many, many things, from visualizing art to doing math problems to foreign language. There's a whole bunch of domains, music, recognition. All right. So you can imagine the problem's going to get a little worse here in a moment as I do this. What if we go way out there? Which basically is nearly 0. So it's likely, if I'm not invited back for at least a year, I'm happy to come sooner if you guys need, but if a year from now, those 6 cute items we were doing, gone, right? The muscle lifting thing, the stories of Malcolm Cox, they're all gone. That's why I can talk about Malcolm now. If you don't play this video ever again, I'm safe, right? So we have a problem. We can't have all this effort of a wonderful medical school and have a year later not retaining this stuff. So if you were to add a study gap, some amount of time between learn and relearn, what you can do is you can climb back up on the curve. Now, we can concede where that is in the curve is back to only about 20% at a year later. So it's not a whole bunch of retention at 1 year, even with the study gap. But what's interesting to think about, though, is this. That line right there, it was red, or I can make it green and blue. That line is the highest height of the graph. In other words, for any amount of test delay you have, test delay being that little yellow thing that was down there on the far right, for any amount of test delay you have, there's a max amount you can retain. And why it matters is, and I tried to do this with that green arrow looking like it's bending a little bit, the point is that the longer you need to retain it, the more study gap you need. The longer space you need between learn and relearn in order to maximize yourself on the graph. At some point, if the space is too much, you get a little bit of a wane. But in general, the problem is not enough space between learn and relearn for long-term retention. I will stop for a second. Does anyone want to, is that okay? Are we okay on this idea of study gap? Space and time between learn and relearn helps. More space and time between learn and relearn helps more for longer-term retention. All right. Have no fear, because we're going to space the learning in the talk, and I can get back to this. All right. Study gap helps. Interleaving is way easier. So integrated design, learning multiple things simultaneously, creates the interleaving effect. You can block by type, A, B, 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 C, 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 or you can interleave, A, B, C, B, C, A, C, A, B. How many people speak a second language? Excellent. How many people speak a third language? Right. How many of you 3 language learners, really cool, how many of you have spoken 3 languages since you were little? Excellent. That most elegant mind. So it turns out that those who would learn 3 languages when they're little, any pediatricians in the room? Okay, phew, I need to have a witness. All right. So if you learn 3 languages when you're little, children often will get speech delay if they're having all 3 at once. But they don't have a speech problem. They just have speech delay in each of the 3 languages because they're trying to put together 3 languages at once. If they keep doing all 3 languages, they can come out able at all 3 languages, which is terrific. They're trilingual. It's amazing. It's better than that. So let's say it were that it was English, French, and Russian. And those aren't, I mean, French and English have some similarities, but generally those are different languages, distinct enough. For the 3 language learning person, were you to teach them a 4th language that's quite different, let's say Mandarin, which is not like those first 3, they're far more able to learn the 4th language than someone who only had learned 2 or only 1. So the advantage is not just that they have 3 languages. That's a huge advantage already. Is they're actually better at language generally. They're just better at language. The language center is more developed. But they had that burden of speech delay. So it turns out, much like some of the studies we've seen in the past, where there's a short-term sort of non-benefit, I guess this cramming is a benefit, but there's a short-term thing and a longer-term thing. In this case, with interleaving, it's a benefit to have gone through the hard work, apparently. You see how these domains overlap? Is it a desirable difficulty to learn 3 languages at once? Apparently so. Here's some data. If you interleave and you're tested 5 minutes later, you are disadvantaged compared to a person who studies in blocks. This cramming notion does benefit people shortly thereafter. But if it's even a week later, you have maintenance of the multiple things simultaneously in a way which shows this typical 90-20 drop of people who cram or do block learning. Again, there are many domains for which this has been seen. Language, I'll give you an example of language, but there's, again, memory of faces and art and music. There's all sorts of math, science. All right. So the little kind of memory jog here I have for you is this sort of blah, boom. Again, block learning and cramming wanes, even if it has a short-term benefit within a day. So we already know this, because nobody would do math for 8 weeks and then no more math. And then English for 8 weeks and no more English and no more math. And then biology for 8 weeks and then no more biology, no more. Right? We don't do block learning throughout our entire time in school. Right? We were doing English for years and years and math for years and years. It'll come as a surprise to you, I suppose, to tell you that I took English for 12 years, even though I still speak like this. But we've done this throughout most of our lives, and in most schools, whether they're elementary or all the way through high school, college, even professional schools go longer than medical school for some odd reason. So spaced and interleaved, or longitudinal integrated, is the normal thing until we get to med school where we actually make blocks. Right? All right. That's my small advertisement. I'll stop it at that. All right. So the memory thing here for spacing and interleaving is as follows. Use time. Create enough time between learn and relearn for longer-term retention. That's this. Now, of course, the other thing is that. The shuffled cards, or the A, B, C, B, C, A, C, A, B, or the sort of multiple things simultaneously, the many languages at once. Mix experiences and learn and practice many things at once. That is spacing and interleaving. All right. Oh, yes, he's giving you so many chances to hold on to the 6 things, so many chances. I'm spacing it a little bit. Dweck's the last sort of thick part of the talk. The deliberate practice is quite short, and then we're all done. So Dweck is an area of my research, I must confess. I love Dweck's work. I don't love so much the pop culture of Dweck. I like the actual science of Dweck, so I'll try to stick to that. And again, the notion, if you have not read this book, I would just say it's just brilliant. But the notion basically is the getting back on the horse idea. So where does her work come from? So there's a whole bunch of theorists. I don't want to say theory is not science, but there are theorists that underpin Dweck. Dweck is science. It goes back to John Dewey, and we have Carl Rogers' great work on relationships, and of course Bandura, the architect of social learning theory. Nodding's the great feminist moral development theoretician. Keegan's great work on adult development. The people who are into situated situated learning theories, and workplace learning, all these great thinkers. But basically, Bandura was the social learning theory was the main influence, along with the work of Seligman on learned helplessness. So those were the two people that she found interesting, and that led us to her work. Learned helplessness and social learning theory. All right, so we have to get into this horse idea. And I will tell you that Dweck's work is exceedingly well done scientifically. There's a whole lot of it, 35 or 40 years worth of her and her grad students at Stanford. And this getting back on the horse notion has been shown both in learning, sort of resilience of learning, benefits to actual learning and retention, but also to resilience in general, human resilience, which is why it kind of spun off into the parenting literature, which we're not going to get into. So let's do this first, okay? I want to think hard about this idea. It's best if I do it with a simple story. I'm going to use the language of the researchers. So I understand in an era where it's very important to be sensitive about gender fluidity and so forth. I'm going to be potentially misunderstood as not sensitive to something which I feel very sensitive about. I'm just going to use the language that the researchers themselves use. They use the word boys and girls is how they describe it. So there were, quote, boys and girls in a classroom. They were 6 or 7 years old. The researchers went to observe the classroom. This is back in the mid-'80s. It turned out that those who were girls were observed to be doing substantially better in these classes. They were performing at a higher level. They were getting more feedback. They were getting more voluminous and big feedback. The boys, it was kind of like a pack of squirrels. Right? They're just all over the place. They could stay in a chair. It was a great day. Get off the wall, John, whatever. All right. So the boys were not getting as much feedback. They weren't performing as well. The feedback wasn't so voluminous or so dramatic. To the girls, outstanding Kathy, brilliant Laura. Big words directed at the learners. To the boys, keep it up, Hershey, or something like that. I get that. All right, hang in there, Dave. So they gave the children problems they could not solve. And what happened was, the boys would sit there and be like, I'll figure this out. There's some trick here. And they try to figure it out. They'd hang in. The girls, I'm so stupid. I can't do this. I was never good at this kind of stuff. School is ridiculous. Very negative and very self-negative, which is quite upsetting for the researchers to see, as you might imagine. It's upsetting to know about that. So it bothered them. They were great researchers, so empirically, they just kind of watched and watched and watched and tried to figure out, what is going on? Why is this happening? And they thought maybe it has to do with this feedback is different, maybe. The girls are getting these gigantic noun, adjective, outstanding, brilliant. And the boys really are getting more of this process feedback. I noticed the way Dave Bettinelli is listening. I like the way you're sitting there quietly. That blink conveyed to me you're actually listening. About something that's actually going on, right? Something that you're actually doing. So they crossed over. They taught the teachers to cross over the language of feedback. So the boys would get these nouns, not bigger or smaller than they deserved, actual to their level of quality, actual nouns or adjectives. And the girls would get process feedback, not bigger or smaller than they actually deserved, but more about what they were doing. And of course, as the story would suggest to you, they gave the children problems they could not solve. And the boys quit. I'm so stupid, I'm so bad, I can't do this. And the girls hung in, chin scratching or trying to figure out how to solve it. They were curious and interested and stayed with the work. So that was the very beginning of Dweck's kind of core work about what prompts people to hang in and be resilient in their learning and also resilient in the not self-deprecating, hence learning and resilience are the two key domains of Dweck. And it led to a tremendous amount of brilliant research thereafter. All right. Her question became, why do people, quote, fall apart despite having received praise, having confidence, and having a long history of successes? You can imagine how that would arise out of that observed set of studies. So she posed two, what she called implicit theories, which they later called self-theories. That's the name of that book I showed you. So one theory is the so-called incremental theory, and the other one is called the entity theory. Entity like object and entity. Incremental, like a process. Incremental growth is a process. So the growth or learning mindset co-varies with this sort of incremental theory, and the fixed or performance mindset with the entity theory. Let me explain that for a second. These are self-theories, and they're implicit, meaning that we hold them about ourselves, and we don't necessarily even know we hold them, although sometimes we do know we hold them. So if you said to me, Dave, do you think you're good at language? I'd say, no, I'm not really that good at language. Classic entity. I, Dave, am not good at language. My entity is not good at language. If you said, Dave, do you think you could actually, run a 10K? I'd say, sure, if I trained. right? I, Dave, believe that if I simply kept doing the work and kept practicing, I would get better, right? So I'm incremental apparently about sports, or about running anyway. The growth mindset is that which says that if I keep working at it, I can get better. The fixed mindset is that I am what I am. My vessel is, I can fill it up, I can just fill it up. I'm not an athlete, or I am an athlete, but whatever the vessel is, it is, the entity. 80% of people, repeatedly, this is decades of studies, 80% of people, in about ratios of 40 to 40, domain after domain, hold either an incremental or entity view of their ability in some domain. So I could ask you, do you think you're good at foreign language? Do you think you're good at sports? Whatever. Do you think you're good at piano or music? It's key that self-theories are domain specific. And the things that she studied so much were things like intelligence, talent, moral character. But do you think you're smart? As if smartness itself somehow is something you can work on and get better at, or is it just you're born smart? That's the kind of incremental versus entity notion. They're networks of complexes or of beliefs often held unconsciously. So that's the notion of what self-theories are, as opposed to the praise literature and the parenting literature. Now, I couldn't resist. I'm thinking that today might be a Wednesday after a Tuesday. Something happened yesterday. But anyway, so you'll see where I'm going with this. Entity and incremental theorists, that is, she calls them theorists, it's the theory you hold about yourself, are equal in general in intelligence and in baseline academic achievement, but not in ultimate achievement. Why? Because those who hold the incremental or growth mindset actually can go further, which is predictable, right? They're going to stick at something and keep going and try to get better and better at it in spite of the barriers. They're nourished by process. The entire modern expertise literature looks at this idea of those who are the ever novices, who can look at that same problem they've known so well for so many years and just want to see it again and again, anew, the ever novice. That's what the expertise literature is basically about now. Expertise, those who just they keep on sort of trying to go through barriers and see things anew. Entity theorists, see if you can follow my earlier little point there, are more judgmental, more rapidly adopt stereotypes than incremental theorists. How cool would the study be? To think about, like, the American Cold Civil War that we're having right now, right? Is there something in this and that? One wonders. Self-theories can be changed and lead to expected changes in behavior. That's the good news. So if our country is having these hard arguments, we don't have to be entity about them. We can be incremental about them, right? About ourselves and our views and about others and their views. So that's good news. Same is true for learning, though, right? Students who might seem unable at something or might, in a tacit way, perceive themselves as not able at something, right? These are changeable. These are mutable. So before I finish the dweck, I just want to do one more thing that goes through this. Sorry, it's only one more story. My wife and I are walking in the mountain country above Cape Town, in Stellenbosch in South Africa, and we're walking along. I have my camera ready. It's a beautiful town. We had done some education work there for a week or so, and I stop. I pull up the camera. I take this photograph. My wife, who's an actual, legitimate, real educator, not like her husband. She's a real educator. She says, "Oh, no. Please tell me you're not seeing a metaphor for medical education in this." And I was. And then she goes further. "Oh, no, please, seriously, is this going to be an ethical erosion thing?" It was. That's what I was seeing. We're very well matched. So I was thinking, yeah, these students, they're verdant, they're green, they're new green life, they're flowers ready to bloom. And look what our system of healthcare, our system of education can do to them. It's like razor wire holding them back. I was quite animated, you know. She just stood and shook her head. And then, feeling a bit of shame, I and she then at the same time we said, yeah, you know what? Probably enough with the medical education metaphors. It's actually a much better metaphor for South Africa, right? So I've sobered up. Okay. This is one. I went to Dartmouth College, and this was actually, I sat right across from this in Dartmouth College's basement. It's a similar story, though, right? There's this alma mater. You can see her, the ossified university there, alma mater, on her bed of books of Western civilization, delivering those same heartless, soulless, stillborn little babies that live their lives in these glass bottles and just grow up to be reproductions of the academy themselves, heartless and soulless. You can imagine. Ernest Martin Hopkins solicited a painter to paint the bottom of Dartmouth's entire library. He picked Jose Clemente Orozco in the 30s. He didn't know how it would look until it was finally unveiled. And this is the kind of stuff that I have to be a harsh critique of all of Western civilization and the academy. But I do think it's an interesting question around this issue of ethical erosion is whether our universities, not this one, but whether our universities themselves, our med schools themselves, are turning out the full three-dimensional, full-hearted, fully soulful graduates that we wish for. Ethical erosion is the study of that question, right? So it's this idea that came from 1994 about students' decline in, quote, professionalism, using 1994 definitions of that, but we can consider professionalism being writ large. And there are a bunch of studies that followed this original. The original was by Feutner and Christakis. It was in academic medicine. They surveyed the 6 Eastern Pennsylvania medical schools, which are 6 pretty different medical schools, which is kind of a good sampling. 665 students. There's page after page after page of bad news. I picked one page. The 665 students who are doing their clinical work there, what percent heard derogatory comments about patients? Answer, 98%. So this is not swearing or lewdness. This is derogatory comments about patients, directed at the patient, which invites the question, like what number would be okay there? Like 64% would be all right, or 48? It seems like that's kind of a high number, right? But it probably isn't as bad as the next one, who felt like an accomplice to a crime by participating on the house officer-led inpatient teams in that year in those schools, 32%. So the study was well done, but if we want to quibble with the study, that's fine. Again, there are lots of data in this study. But what it did was it launched a literature looking into the harm the med school might do to our learners. And a whole bunch of cool studies followed, including our friend Paul Hadett's work, which used a validated survey instrument and looked at students, and it found a decline in patient-centeredness as a consequence of medical education, primarily in the clinical year. Or students' empathy declining, primarily in the clinical year. And this is using a series of different validated tools that look at vicarious empathy. Or students having decreased blunted moral development throughout medical school, principally in the core clinical year. This is using perhaps the most validated tool of all of social psychology at the time, Lawrence Kohlberg's DIT survey. And here's the thing. The easy response might be, you know what, they're just getting older. Or, it's professional school, it's graduate school. No, it turns out it's medical professional school. It's not even dentistry or nursing. It's medical school that was doing this. Well, it's not going to hurt them later. No, it turns out what hurts them now does hurt them later. And there's lots of studies that give you the 4 archetypal ones. So that's the notion of ethical erosion. I raise it for you because can we think about ethical erosion through the lens of Dweck? Because after all, she studies learning and she studies resilience. Okay, so I bring us back to our page for the main purpose here. The answer is a yes to the question, right? The self theories can be changed. People can be turned from an entity theorist into an incremental theorist. They can go from believing they can't learn something to believing they can learn something and go further thereby. They can be made actually more resilient in their learning and made more resilient. How lucky for us. Because med schools are a very special place to build the idea of resilience of learning, but also an amazing place to think about resilience of our human respect for others, dignity, altruism, service, right? I can't clinically reason. You can clinically reason, right? So there are ways of fostering the incremental growth mindset, and Dweck shows us that through very hard science over many, many years. So for Dweck, let's hold on to these notions. We want to foster being nourished by the process, from the hard work and from getting back up. So I'm going to do one little quick thing in closing to this. Dave, you still talk kind of fast at the talk, and maybe you're a little hyperbolic and a little nutty. I know you feel comfortable at Hofstra and Zucker, Hofstra, Norwell. You feel good here, but you probably could still be a little more refined, a little more professorial, not your kind of crazy adolescent self. To which I could answer, I haven't quite refined that talk yet. This notion of the yet is one of the good ways of helping us flip ourselves and others into this idea of the incremental or growth mindset. The idea that there is a somewhere yet out there that someone has not yet achieved. My poor children go to Dweckian devised schools with my Dweckian educator wife and poor me, and they come home and they'll say yeah, I had that shot on goal today and I missed, so I just don't have my shot quite right yet. It's like it's become such a game. We're calling ourselves the Yetis, right? You should see our kitchen table. It's just ridiculous. Yet. All right. So I wanted to do one last kitsch thing here. There's you see the little barbed wire thing. I turned it into the non-barbed wire thing. All right, thank you. All right, So finally, deliberate practice is very quick to do, and then we can negotiate together the end. It's this idea of coaching, self-coaching or being coached by another. The classic paper, and I understand that Dr. Battinelli was just with Anders Ericsson recently. There's some classic papers that looked at experts and what creates sort of expert performance. It's a little different than the expertise literature, but incredibly important. And you'll see that it involves DWAC and it involves desirable difficulties. It's a cool constellation of many of the things we've thought about. So here's the quick list. You must have a mental representation of the work performance. What should that symphony sound like? What's the piece I'm playing supposed to sound like? Not necessarily by the person who's so much better than you, at sort of where you're trying to go next. You must practice a lot. You must practice often. You must study and read ahead of time. And a lot of that is solitary work. We can quibble about whether it should be YouTube videos or students should be reading things or who knows what, right? But there has to be some degree of practice, and you must practice on the most difficult parts. There's this whole notion out there of what's called Strengths Finder. You'll see this in like the bookstore at the airport, Strengths Finder, which means like, forget all that stuff about trying to find what's hard. Find what is your soul. Do what is your core thing. And by the way, I would say that's a totally cool idea. It's just that it's not the same thing as fostering the best of your learning. So for joy, Strengths Finder, fair enough. But if you really want to get better at stuff, you got to go for the hard stuff. You got to go to your weaknesses. You've got to receive corrections. So if you, and Anders Ericsson is clear about this, you can't just practice and not get corrected. Right? So practicing a lot matters. Practicing the hard parts matters. Doing the hard work matters. But you got to get corrected. And you got to get corrected a lot. 10,000 hours is not a thing. 10,000 hours with somebody riding you warmly, but helping you correct the things, that's a thing. Better yet, if you have your self-theory of incremental growth mindset, where you're nourished by process. So getting corrected is part of, it's cool. I like being nourished by fixing stuff, by getting better, by not having it come easy. You must exert some effort beyond one's comfort zone, desirable difficulties. It's linked to the self-theories. So, in summary, to build expertise, one must try and fail, focus on weakness, put a lot of effort in, and persist despite difficulties. So there it is. Practice makes progress. Over there is the memory cue. Do the work, make mistakes, get corrected, persist. Do the work, make mistakes, get corrected, persist. Do the work. That's the essence of Anders Ericsson's work on deliberate practice. All right, we've done 6. We've done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you know what's coming here. Because we're showing testing for learning, because we're spacing, because we interleaved. All right. So what are the 6 domains of educational science today? Now here's the thing. If this comes quick and easy to you, you're not actually going to hold on to it as long. So what I would do is, if you have the 6 quickly right now, what you should do is, maybe you could picture the image, or say, do I really get that what generation really is? Try to generate maybe an example that goes along with you this. Like, do the hard work of not just making the list, but of trying to connect something to the list. Make sense? All right. Right? So let's do that. Having the 6 is one thing. Being able to explain the 6 is something different. So just quickly, grab a neighbor and see if you can explain. Maybe pick the one that's hardest for you to explain, and explain that one. What do you got? I think what's cool to me is there probably is something about like how learning works, and these are all just different, and they're similar, but different ways of trying to get at that. Like DWAC is linked to Anders Ericsson, which is linked to, yeah.
So you at this year's AMC?
I didn't go because I'm going to China. I'm going to China tomorrow.
You know, Angela Duckworth.
Yeah, of course, grit. Yeah.
Grit and reference DWAC quite a bit.
Yeah, they're very linked. And I I appreciate sort of her story and how right.
But there are multiples going on at the same time.
I think that's right. Yeah. And I think we can design our schools and our classes. Not like we can do all of these things all the time, but we can try to. Even the yetting is it's so stupid, but it actually, when a student's like, oh gosh, I just don't have this, you're like, yeah, I don't have it yet.
Well, one of the things that we have issues with occasionally is, and every school is the same. Everybody thinks it's here versus someplace else.
No, I agree with you.
Is that you'll get some 3.9, 520
Yeah.
MCAT from Columbia. You can't do it there.
I know. By lists don't do it. Lists don't do it. Right? You gotta go to it's a translation step.
But there's some other thing in there where they just, I don't want to say they're not trying.
There's
That's the way it appears.
yeah.
They appear to place blame on everything
I
except
can't
themselves.
stand that either. Did you see the World Series? I thought it was fascinating. It was good. I mean, notwithstanding the winners, but just there was a lot in that about like.
My take on the World Series is, you have to win, 4 times in 15 years. You got 3 first-year managers, which means that it's not the manager.
It's very different teams.
And obviously, John Henry's the owner, he gets some credit. But I don't know what world the credit goes to, except I'll flip it on its head and say that the Yankees should get all the blame. They had 50, 60 years, didn't do a thing.
We're going to talk more about that. I agree. We can keep going. So I actually, that game with Nathan Eovaldi going the 8 innings, taking a loss. That's grit, right? It wasn't about the winning. It's the hanging in, right? All right, you guys. True. That's true. It's true. Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating. All right, so I just thought it's kind of fun to sort of then think about like, well, how would I make a class, or how would I be on rounds like this, or how to translate these. So maybe the responsible thing with me to say is I realized that I did not create like the translation step, rather just the presentation of the stuff. But maybe the joy is in the translating. And if you haven't figured out a way to translate it, it's not because you're not a good translator. It's because you're not a good translator yet. All right. Here are the 6. So that's the image of the test-enhanced learning. Solvable difficulties. Do you know which one's coming next? What's the image? Fast thumb. Yeah, right. So a way of quizzing also is to do that. As you read something, think, yeah, oh yeah, okay, good. Or read a paragraph and cover it up, right? Just make it harder, make it slower, be deliberate. Go for the hard stuff. And of course, do the hard work, get coached, get corrected, keep going. Ooh. And don't forget, the degree to which retrieval is not just retrieval. Retrieval is a way of learning. Doing retrieval practice, which is also called testing for learning, is a way of creating the retrieval benefit or retention later. All right. All right, so that is 6 learning theories for our Welcome to the Academy night. Thank you for including me again. So do you, fair enough. So would it be helpful to do, you want to do questions? You want to play with ideas together? Alice, what makes you guys? Yeah. All right. Do you want? I'll repeat the question so they're on the. So the difference between the two groups is that they're both notified the test is forthcoming. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But one group cannot restudy.
One group, we know that the test is 1 week after. The other group doesn't know that.
Right. Okay.
They don't know when the test is at all.
That's correct.
They just know it, but they know that at some point they'll be tested, but not really.
Yes, well, I was thinking actually, I didn't ask it that way because it would be too complex, but my idea was if you divide it into 3 groups,
Right.
one don't even know that they're going to test. The second group, they know that there will be tests at 1 week, and the third group will know that at some point there will be tests, but but the idea is that they will not have access. Or the other way is, yes, they could have access to restudy.
Right. So the fun thing is, does it put some of the ideas in contest, right? So like we know that cramming helps. So anyone who knew when it was would have the benefit of the cram effect. On the other hand, if you have a chance for deliberate spacing, right? Like so, I'm going to learn something. I'm going to do something else. I'm going to learn something again. The again is the spacing, and the something else makes it interleaved. Like if people can set up for learning in a certain way, they can foster retention for the test and beyond. I don't know. So what do we think? I will answer first by saying I've not read a trial like that. I read a lot of this stuff, and I love this stuff. I've not read that trial. I do know one more that might be fun, which we didn't get into, and it comes from behavioral economics, which is this idea of the priming effect, right? And there's lots of fun studies about the priming effect. So, for example, this study was actually done where they had people who had to, I think it was something like they had to stop by and pay a parking meter and then do something on the way to confession. And it was the whole setup was that the parking meter was broken, right? And like you couldn't actually pay, and some people like put the coin in, kept trying to put the coin in. Other ones were like, yeah, whatever, and they walked away. And the question of if they were going to confession, did it make a difference? Did their behavior at the meter change by knowing they were going up to confession? They have all sorts of studies like that, which are kind of, I mean, I kind of get it, but it seems a little mean on the other hand. But there's all sorts of studies where they look at like whether you give some hint of something that's forthcoming, and does the behavior change in the front end as a consequence. That's in the economics literature. What do we think though for learning? I think it's a fun one to play with together.
So do you think that the ones who know they will have a test in 1 week?
I think they'll cram. Yeah, I think depending on how high stakes the test is, if it doesn't count at all, your study gets more, I think it's more interesting in some ways, right? If it's going to be a high stakes test, they're going to start cramming as soon as they hear, right? I mean they'll cram and go without food, and they won't pee, and like my entire life it was just on this one test is my entire. I make the joke because partly we have a problem in medical education because of what we bring into our medical schools are people who have been for much of their lives getting the benefit of being entity theorists. I'm an A student. I got a citation in organic chemistry. Like these kind of like, as if I am that thing, entity, right? As opposed to, I broke my butt in organic chemistry, whew, as your measure of how you did, right? The I broke my butt is a measure of I was nourished by the process of working hard at it. Whereas I got an A is sort of like I and my grade are one. We're an entity. So it's a little tricky when we think about what we're doing as we sort of decide on who should go to medical school. Yeah, I don't know the answer from a study. My gut belly old man educator thinking is they're going to cram. Cool, thanks. Yeah, hi.
So David, one of the things that I've heard from many, many physicians that I'm interested in how you would fit it into this paradigm is the things I learned and never forgot. I learned in the heat of being responsible for the care of a patient.
I love this.
How does that fit? Which of these do you think are active in that setting that drive long-term retention?
Yeah, I think people throwing out numbers. So yeah, interleaving is also interesting. But I was gonna throw out one that's like item 7. So some of you may know and some of you probably don't know. So I am in the Department of Internal Medicine. I'm also in the Department of OBGYN. I'm in 2 departments. So I am the one not midwife, not OBGYN person in the Women's Health Center of my hospital. They have like one primary care-ish person in the Women's Health Center. The consequence of that is that I have, I would consider, it is incredibly painful, and I feel incredibly fortunate for the chance to sit for a long time with people who've suffered a whole array of trauma, the endemic problem of our society, I would dare say. And I've read a lot about that. So it relates, though, the PTSD literature actually has overlaps with learning literature in this way. If things are too shocking, we actually lose capacity for good memory, for parts, for little parts. It's not like you lose your memory for all huge parts, but there are segments, there are missing dots. And sometimes they're actually bigger for severe injury, even more time. That's findable again, but it requires lots of help, love, and support and guidance. Leaving that hard example away for a second, for things that are sort of shocking, that kind of have an energy to them, but aren't so injuriously shocking, our memory is actually heightened, a better memory. We retain longer, more clearly. There are people who study to find out about this Dweck stuff through a healthcare lens, because there are some people who've had severe trauma, males and females, and sometimes soldiers and so forth, who actually have incredibly precise memory, clear memory of the events. So one can't say that all severe trauma causes memory loss or gain. There's a diverse set of things in that pool. But in the less than severe pool, it's almost sure the memory is improved. There's literature that shows, right? So I'm wondering, the answer to your question I don't know, but I'm wondering whether having some amount of like, this is important, you're kind of somewhat fired up, but it's not traumatic, gives you the benefit of memory. There's another thing that guides me though, which is long before we had all this fancy stuff, and in parts of the world to this day, there are communities where the oral history of the way the anthropologists would say the tribe, but of the people, is told not solely through written forms. It was often told through oral traditions. There are these great stories of like the children get to hear the stories at night before, as they fall asleep and these kind of things. So there's a second thing that I think also informs my answer, I've not read it as an academic piece, which is the human quality of the living narrative is also memorable in a way to humans. So I think part of it is the animation of it matters, it's meaningful, I'm in this, you're kind of fired up to help, but it's not too traumatic. And part of it, I think, is the human, soulful, like the living narrative. It's about a person. It's not a paper case. That's my best guess. But what do you think?
If I would answer my own question, I think it's in the appropriate difficulty level. Or I would substitute the appropriate
Learning
learning tension.
tension, yep.
You know, super learning tension is not great.
Right.
And no learning tension is not great.
The Vygotsky.
And somewhere in between for each person is the right learning tension.
So the sort of ZPD, zone of proximal development, notion in the green. Yeah.
The learning difficulty, but I think
Yes.
it gets at the same thing.
The neuroscience of this is also a fascinating question. Like, if you think about some of the literature, I'm about to go talk at an autism conference in China in a few days, and I must just tell you, I'm not going to tell the audience, but I knew very little about autism until like the last month. But I've been reading a lot about this, and it's interesting thinking about like how there's some of these extraordinary capacities of parts of our brains that are, but then there's other capacities that might be harder and that our brains are so kind of complex and elegant in this way, and we don't have the neurobiology or the neuroscience yet. Where are you? There's neuroscientists in the room. Yes. Haha. Yes. I think I'm correct in saying that we don't have entirely enough kind of clarity in the neuroscience yet of what provokes best kind of capacity building, skill building, memory retention by experience. Is that a kind of a globally bizarre enough to be true? All right. All right.
But I also think there's some of that interweaving so that was one of my questions about the difference between interweaving and integration.
Mm.
Should we be focused more on interweaving or integration? Because you said there's distinct differences between them,
Yes.
even though there's overlap.
Yes. Okay. So there's a lot of, the literature on integration that fascinates me. So integration, the way that I often use it with like longitudinal integrated clerkships, is this idea of a curricular design that has multiple things being done simultaneously over time, like the language learning example. There's other ways of thinking about integration. So like Nikki Wood's work and the people at the Wilson Center at Toronto have a whole bunch of people who are studying cognitive integration. I think, for me, a very refined way of clarifying it, I have to confess that the problem I'm having right now, and speaking of PTSD, is an example I give comes from my hard New York City example that I'm sensitive to probably not give. So I'm going to try to do this without using my normal example. One kind of integration is, imagine this sort of the basic lowest level is juxtaposition, side-by-sidedness. So you have a bunch of marbles of different colors. You can sort of smush them together. And the reds can be with the reds, and the blues can be with the blues. You can have some orderliness, so it's sort of integrated in some way. That's a low-level notion of integration. So that's adjacency. And the example I would have given was about this idea of meaningful adjacency. It's when you don't do things, for example, in alphabetical order. You might do them you might cluster by some other way that gives more rich meaning by the reclustering. You make a deliberate choice to recluster in some other way. So you can imagine sometimes with classrooms, how you cluster students can foster a different kind of meaningful adjacency. There's great work, again, in some behavioral economics, but also in social psychology, around this one's very important for us now, too, in the US. When we think about issues of diversity in neighborhoods, right? So, or in school or whatever. Is diversity, the researchers ask, the presence of multiple differences? Or is it the functional presence of multiple people with differences? So you can have meaningful adjacency by sort of making a class that has opportunities for people to be more than just side by side. But there's nothing quite as integrated as true co-practice. So it turns out that when you integrate neighborhoods in the US, all right, across an array of axes, people don't have more social cohesion. But if in those integrated neighborhoods, people go bowling together, or they go to the Elks Lodge, I'm making these kind of, whatever these things that put us together, they coach Little League together. If I say Little League, I can wake you back up again, all right? Those things actually do create integration. We humans have to do stuff together, know each other in ways beyond specific demographic features ways. So side-by-sidedness, meaningful side-by-sidedness, adjacency, meaningful adjacency, and then there's the actual functioning together notion. So that's another framework for integration which I find most helpful, because it keeps me away from the idea of being satisfied by side-by-side, or even sort of like, I thought I was being so thoughtful in how I made this side-by-sidedness occur of topics, and instead create the cognitive integration. Well, watch that. It either works or it doesn't work. Because watch this. No, watch. This is great that you raised this. So if it is that you, like, let's say we take nurses and doctors and put them together. You put two different sort of groups of people trained professionally together. It turns out that doesn't create either interprofessional practice or a better feeling about the other. In fact, the studies would demonstrate that your feeling about the other is worse. It tends to foster the objectification more. But if it's actually, as Dean Smith was suggesting earlier, that we're functioning together for this sick patient all night long, we're really in on this together, that actually does build it, barring a problem, right? So yeah, so there's something in the functionality that matters enormously, not just side by side. Yeah. Can I go back in the front?
Okay. First of all, thank you so much. It was really brilliant and learned a lot, very stimulating. I could see how this model works so well for learning knowledge. And I could see how well this model works for learning a skill. In terms of attitudinal change, I think it may be more complex. And so what I'm wondering about and thinking about is the dilemma we face with moral dilemma, decline in empathy, humanism, and we're struggling with, and we do this in the curriculum. We teach empathy, and we have ways to do it that's very structured. But are you aware of any place in this country or any school in this country that really, I know there's efforts at Harvard in empathy, but that really views empathy as a learnable thing with an integrated curriculum that could be approached in this way?
Right. So I know. So first of all, that's a very cool question. I like that a lot. And the value placed on the idea that, well, before I do that, how about this? Did anybody see Michael Kahn's paper that was called Etiquette-Based Medicine? It's playing on the verbal flourish of evidence-based medicine, right? Etiquette-based medicine. If I just say the right things, right, it's enough because we can't actually be sure that we can train people up for empathy. So goes the argument. I'm being unfair, I think, a bit, but that's, in the very least, we should be cordial and civil. Now, there's a whole movement right now about civility, right, in the U.S. And I think there's a lot of activists, and I would want to count myself among them, that take a hard view of civility, right? What was the line what did Jelani Cobb say about civility? It was something like, it's something like, I'm going to misquote him, but it's something like civility is the con man's greatest tool, right? Now, he's being biting when saying that, but the point he's trying to make is the mere fact of having verbal exchanges which meet some standard of goodness actually takes away the righteous fire that we should have to go do social repair. That's an argument. So when we think about this in medical education, this question of empathy, I mean, I think nobody would argue that we shouldn't be civil and respectful and, have the proper etiquette vis-a-vis our patients. But I think there's a very important pressure to ask ourselves, is that the same thing as having empathy? I think researchers would say no, which then gets us to the question that you're asking, which is that trainable? Now, as a Dweckian person, I'm inclined to say yes, but I've read no carefully construed sort of science-based paper that demonstrates the application of, like, can we make the growth mindset for empathy? I do know of the neuroscience that suggests, and again, I'm feeling like I'm going to go into neuroscience here. That's going to be like way bad. But okay. But am I right that small amygdala, bad thing, right? In general. So that's about the best I can do on short notice. I mean, there are clearly people who are psychopathic who've been demonstrated to have anatomical differences from the sort of the general population. Let's leave them out for a second. They can run for office if they need to, whatever. So it's a new day. It's a new day. All right. So the question for me ends up being one that, because I don't know the answer, I think I want to fall on the side of we should do our level best to try to model and make the right space for and train for empathy. Do I know of a school that does that? I know of many schools that do many things in this regard. Have I seen one that has great data where the data, they say something far beyond other schools? I have not seen that ever. Is it sort of one of the central foci of my professional life? It is. I just find that the idea that we would have science absent full-hearted, soulful empathy to be very scary-making. That we would have empathy absent science just entirely effete, right? So that the both of them, that we can have schools help maximize both of them, seems like it's our charge. But you're asking a how-to question for which I have no great answer. Does that seem? I'm sort of saying, like, yeah, let's do it, but I don't know models that have shown better. Yeah, I will say this though: there are some schools that care more about it than others. So, yeah, I promise. Yeah.
Dr. Smith's question. So, just to go back to that, I would think have us consider that there's another dimension. So you have the 6 interleaved spacing, dweck, etc. But there's the neuroscience would be salience.
Yeah.
The translation to education theory would be sociocultural authenticity of role.
Yes, nice. Yes.
So this idea that
Yes.
I think part of what drives it is being in the zone, approximately having the right amount of stress, but it's also the salience of having real
Yeah, I strongly.
I think if you see the maximum of the LIC, is that when you're in a team over time, there's much more of a chance of you being included and starting to take on roles that are meaningful. Of course, I mean, so anyways, put that out there.
No, I like this a lot, John. So I think so. LICs could be kind of crazy making when you first try to make them. There's all sorts of things that I think we could be rightly, aware of. I think one of the big downstream benefits of it has to do with the idea of getting meaningful roles or authentic roles and salience as a consequence of the other formulation, which I know you know so well, which is just around trust. So the trust issue with humans is fascinating. I don't mean the whole entrustment EPA thing, which I'm happy to get into at length if it would help everybody sleep better, but or sleep immediately. But just basic issues of trust, which I think is also in play in the current American geopolitics too, right? Trust or relationship strength or those notions of proximity between people that generates a different kind of knowing and being with one another, that can foster, in my view, salience. At least that's what Love and Wenger are suggesting. Do you know, though, so does everyone know these notions of Jean Love and Etienne Wenger, the situated learning? So this is a sloppy effort is that human beings often put in situations, and learners are surely put in these situations, where they're at the periphery of the meaningful engagement of whatever the activity is. They kind of, they come into the thing and they're kind of new in the cafeteria, I don't know where I sit. They're kind of, or I'm new in the clinic, I don't know what my role is, or I'm new in the classroom, I'm not quite sure like how my engagement goes. We're on the periphery. And through social learning theory and other theories would suggest that we can kind of sort of move to the center. The center is not a place. It's a place of comfort, acceptance, being part of the work, being part of the club. And as it's happening, of course, our cognitive load is decreasing. We feel a little more like we're able to be more fluid in this space, and we're not worrying quite like, am I allowed to say something now or not? We can sort of, we have legitimate peripheral participation that can become more and more legitimate as we're sort of less and less peripheral, I guess. But it's an extraordinary and important theory, and about 100 pages of book, which, by the way, if you have to read the book Situated Learning by Jean Love and Etienne Wenger, you have to do some testing for learning, because you got to read a page and be like, whoa, what are they saying? Right, I mean, like again and again, it's a kind of dense, extraordinary book. But I don't know the science of it. So I've never seen like laid out social psychology, cognitive psychology, neurobiology of learning, neuroscience of the theory. I'm not saying that to deride it, but I'm just wondering, do you know of any?
Well, I think the cognitive neuroscience might be about salience.
Yeah. That's for sure. This identification, proximity.
The connection. I mean, my research has been cognitive load theory, and I think this is so there's something about salience in terms of how you look at coding and retrieval and sort of how
I buy that. I think that's right.
but it it's partly overlaps to the stress in its own proximal. That's the connection. I was thinking to the neuroscience.
I like it.
Do you feel the salience also overlaps with deliberate practice, John?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you deliberate practice on something that's not meaningful, right? So
I don't care about it.
right. So I think they complement each other.
I would think so, yeah. I'm thinking as you're talking, I'm creating a 7, and then I'm thinking of parallels.
I'm thinking not as a 7, but as a different dimension. So you've got the 6, and then
Yeah.
salience.
Yeah, that would.
We can't create another. We can't even remember the 6, so we create another and go to 7. We'd really be in trouble.
As long as nobody was insulted by the 3 axes, I'm feeling okay. Should, yeah, yeah.
I thought the fact that you brought in ethical erosion right at the time of Dweck is what sort of blew my mind. I'm worried about these high numbers of burnout, how you define it, to be as present even at the level of medical students.
Yes.
And I've worried that the attitudinals that Joe and Alice work so hard on and teach empathy scripts and try to, I'm worried that when they get to the clinical setting, there's sort of a vulnerability to empathy scorn.
Yeah, it's a good one.
And that how the growth, concept being imbued, bidirectionally with empathy. Because how can I make my empathy as an early learner malleable enough
Yeah.
to stand up to what I actually see when I get out there, compared to what I'm being taught on a pure level. I'm worried about depression and burnout in medical students, and I think they're very vulnerable in that the conveyor belt feel of what happens
I agree.
on the floors and in the clinics. Like we really could miss it. We could miss it because we're not incorporating them and giving them role identity as well as we should, I think. Anyway, I like thinking about fixed versus growth in one's empathy.
I do too.
And being able to take it to a lot of different scenarios with
I like this. Yeah, the burnout, depression, suicidality numbers. I mean, there's a lot of studies and there's a lot of bad numbers, and they just keep coming, and it's shocking. And I have to say, and there's something also in those numbers that has to do with agency as well. Like this, whether I feel people who feel they have some capacity to change their circumstance feel differently than those who feel they cannot. But let's run with the empathy thing for a second. If we believe that there's domain-specific and a wide series of domain-specific self-theories, implicit theories, as Dweck posits, that empathy could be one of them, then the question would be like, what does it look like to do that sort of, I fell off the horse, I gotta dust myself off, I gotta get back on the horse again, and kind of like that, right? Because that's being nourished by process, not nourished by outcomes. And the outcomes come better if you're nourished by process, interestingly. So it seems like one of the ways that we can, there's kind of cool science about this. So in the social psychology literature, there's the commonly understood notion of the fundamental error of attribution. You guys know what this one is? So I'm driving my car, somebody cuts me off, I'm like, oh, that jackass. I go, wow, I can't believe a person cut me off. Now, of course, I've cut people off all the time, right? Knowingly and unknowingly, but I'm not a jackass, I'm a very sweet person, right? So there's this error of attribution we do to others that we don't do to ourselves and wouldn't appreciate it if someone did to us. The proper way out of that, ideally, is that when someone cuts you off, you also could imagine, not that they're just some jerk who's in it to get you, but rather that that's a mother or father rushing home to their sick parent or child. You can imagine all sorts of other things that would be why it is you were cut off and have kind of a good feeling for, oh my gosh, you should go ahead, sir, ma'am. Could empathy not be like that? So I could have an encounter with, I used to run healthcare for the homeless for the city of Cambridge. Heaven knows, there were plenty of patients who at the end of the visit, I would walk out and just kind of be like, all right, that person is kind of not okay. And by not okay, I don't mean their health or well-being. I mean their point of view on their cruelty or their kind of some of the things they said. So my first impulse is sort of to strongly not like that person, right? If they're just mean. But another option is for me to sort of start to lift up and try to imagine, like, how does that sweet boy who played with the ball when they were little end up being this homeless man, right? Is to try to lift up. And I wonder whether that's not the sort of nourished by process action that trains for empathy. I mean, empathy, from the way, way Central European ancient root of it, is from en, paschein, E-N-P-A-S-C-H-E-I-N, en paschein, right? Paschein as in the word passion, as in the suffering, and en meaning within. The reason why it's empathy and not empathy is because in English we just don't like ENP as a thing. So it got, over the years, became an M. So empathy, to take the suffering of the other and put it within yourself. Maybe that's what it is to lift up and imagine like what kind of harm or injury happened to that person over that time. The sweet little blonde boy kicking the ball or brown boy kicking the ball or whoever it was, happy in the backyard, or right is now the kind of. But I'm wondering whether we can, I'm just positing, I'm playing the idea out and publicly, embarrassingly, poorly, just to try to think about this idea you posed.
Patient, don't look as feeling to a patient. I would love for the student to have malleable empathy for not just the patient, but for me.
I asked the same of you all tonight.
So we really have to end with, Joe's gonna go. I'm just giving everybody by 5:45, so we have a little break.
I think part of the challenge is that physicians suffer deeply, and it's very hard to take a step back and think about the patient's point of view when you're suffering so much yourself. So attempts at integrating a greater sense of empathy will have to somehow integrate how we care for ourselves and each other as clinicians. And of course, that's so challenging with all of the understandable economic pressures that clinical entities are under. So, there are layers of complexity in this, of course.
I agree. Yeah, that's lovely how you framed it. I'll end you by just saying, I'll end it by just saying that David Bettinelli should end us. I was going to say about David.
I mean, this is the start of our